Actually, I have to say I was mainly excited and not nervous, and then I got here, and a couple of people said, "Whoa, you're talking to the smartest critic of crypto in Congress. I'm curious to see how that's going to go." And I was like, I'm not.
I question the wisdom of the people you were talking to, but fair enough.
I was trying to think of anything I'm the smartest at, and it's nothing. So anyway, really happy to have you here for this conversation. And I think to that sort of moniker of the smartest guy in Congress on a lot of these issues, you are highly technical. I think it'd be really helpful to get a sense of your background. I know before this you had a long career in clean energy, and you're still very involved in that, as well as some recent legislation around lower prices on generic drugs, better and fair access to legal services. So a wide breadth of things, but be curious to hear how a biochemical engineer got interested in Web3 and how you got here.
So thanks so much for having me. Great to be here. I think I'm still trying to figure out that question, answer that myself. So I was 20 years in the energy industry before getting here. We were always competing against regulated utilities. All the companies I ran had a mission to profitably reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We built 80 some odd projects that did that. And in the last company that we sold in September 16, and I had a midlife crisis and decided to do this thing, our largest customer was Kodak. And because we ran all the utilities at Eastman Business Park, and as you might imagine, that makes your lenders a little bit anxious that we bought the assets as Kodak was emerging from bankruptcy. And there's also, like, if you've ever had the chance, there is something that is sort of beautiful and tragic and inspiring about really getting to know people in a company that was once great. And yes, the offices were a fraction of what they used to be, but there was also this sense that I think there still is of, I am the custodian of George Eastman's legacy, and I don't want this thing to die on my watch, and what am I going to do? And sometimes they did some foolish things, sometimes they did some interesting things. There was a lot of cool technology in there. But one of the things they were doing while we ran them, and you all are going to laugh, but bear with me, was Kodak digital currency. And you could look at that and say, this seems like a really dumb idea by a CEO swinging for the fences to boost their equity valuation. And maybe some of that's true. But what they were doing, which was actually kind of interesting, was they were like, we're the company that invented photography, which means we're also the company that invented professional photographers. And we're also the company that invented the digital camera, which means that we are in some degree responsible for the loss of income to professional photographers who we helped create. And so their idea was, could we create something, a digital currency that would be tied to a digital photograph produced by a Kodak product that would be watermarked, and you could have this pass through. And I don't think the word Web3 existed at the time, and it was frankly really goofy that they called it a currency. But it was a super interesting idea, and so we sort of had that in the back pocket, got to Congress, and that's, I guess that's how I knew about it before. I think I'm sure you got more questions, but that was the background I had on this coming into Congress. It's not a lot of expertise, but it was super interesting and wonky in this little thing that I guess now we call Web3.
Yeah.
And if anybody knows what happened to Kodak currency, I'd love to know. I have no idea.
No, I think it's actually interesting because I think that sense of even the ethos that Kodak was talking about back then of sort of the markets have changed, but we do want to empower photographers, and give back to them and sort of have this sort of accessibility and this distribution has been very resonant for me and I think many others in here. So I think part of this would be really interesting just to hear. I think that sort of resonance is what brings a lot of the folks here, and those are very progressive values in many ways. I think Senator Warren in particular has talked about sort of moving beyond big tech and big banks and worried about access and distribution, debanking, discrimination, and I think in many ways people see Web3 as, okay, here's a way to empower people, it's a creator economy. But in some ways, there's been a disconnect. Is there any? I'd love to get your perspective on sort of even that Kodak ethos of sort of like, let's give back to photographers. Here's a way to do it. Like, why has that not resonated more with progressives in the way that it did for you, even?
Well, when's the last time anybody in Congress talked about Web3? Yes, like cryptocurrency has a Web3 backbone to it, I suppose, but I think that's a separate conversation, right? And I think for me, and what I was going to start to say before, what has been, as a guy who spent, a fair amount of time raising a fair amount of money on Wall Street, it scares the dickens out of me when I see smart people saying really stupid things about financial markets, because that somebody is going to figure out how to make money off you. And when Bitcoin came out and a bunch of smart people were coming and saying, well, this is valuable because it's rare and finite. Like this is a monetary theory that basically hasn't been true since the Knights Templar invented fractional banking in 1200, right? And yet there's a lot of people who had these really garbaged up theories of how money works, of how currency works, that I think infected a lot of this space, where you just get nervous of who's about to be taken advantage of, because someone's going to be taken advantage of in this space. And there was another part to your question that was there, but I think that's about using this as a currency, whatever that means. But it's a currency that's doesn't have access to fractional banking, that doesn't have the full faith and credit of any government behind it, that can't be used to pay your taxes. And the claim that that's valuable, there's lots of things that are rare and finite. Yeah. You don't want to accumulate them, right? I mean, I could think of I could make a lot of off-color jokes right now. That's not a basis of value. And I think that piece has a lot of people nervous about what does that actually mean, and who's being taken advantage of in those markets.
It's actually fascinating, because if you look back at I don't want to take us down a Bitcoin rabbit hole, but looking back at the Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper about Bitcoin, like, it was very much explicitly tied to sort of the opacity of banks and fractional. And there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin community in particular that are very anti-fractional reserve banking, with the idea all of this is on the public ledger.
That's fine, but there's flat earthers too. Like, it doesn't.
Well, it's true. It's true. But I think part of it is, well, sure, but we're so sure about this, we're going to put it on a public ledger so that everybody can see what the reserves are, because everything is on there. But it sounds like part of this it's not even the illicit finance piece. It's, okay, there's Bitcoin, and maybe it is the original, maybe it is all like mathematically capped. But there's a million other tokens out there that it's not so transparent, and we can't tell. Is that fair?
Well, and I think, and I realize this is being sponsored by the Blockchain Association, but like, set the blockchain piece aside from this. Like, I'm just responding to, like, on the currency side, once you get an environment where you're saying, okay, there's people who, if you believe that Bitcoin is a good investment, fine. Like, God bless, go buy some. That's fine, right? Yeah. If, notwithstanding your last speaker, if you think that's subject to the Howey test, if you think that's a commodity, like, a rich conversation to be had, and there's no objection to any of that. I think there's a problem once you start framing this as a currency that has a very specific, that means something different to people, and has an expectation of value, and if that's being framed in a way that's put a different way, there's a concern there. There's a, probably nobody in this news. Anybody know who Fred Kahn is? Does that name resonate with anybody? Nobody. All right. Fred Kahn was the head of the FAA, was the head of the FCC, as a guy who spent a lot of time fighting regulated utilities. He's been a certain inspiration to me, because he led a lot of the deregulatory efforts in the 80s and 90s. And he had this wonderful observation, which I think is true for a lot of this space as well, in a slightly different way, that he said the deregulation shifts the primary burden of consumer protection from rate setting to antitrust enforcement. And deregulation fails when you eliminate the first and don't replace it with the second. And in capital markets, I think there's a similar continuum between, at one extreme, in democratization of access to capital, at the other extreme, investor protection. You can only push on one at the expense of the other. And I think, if I could channel Fred Kahn, the process of democratizing access to capital markets shifts the regulatory burden from determining who is allowed to participate in those markets. Are you a sophisticated investor who can invest in private equity? Do you meet the wealth test? Like, are you allowed to participate? and shifts it from that point to a, we have to mandate huge amounts of transparency and disclosure and audit that everybody is here. And if you only eliminate the first, people are going to get fleeced. And I think that's where, I don't think that's a left-right issue per se. Well, maybe in both cases, at least in today's environment, I think you will find people on the left who are very strongly in support of every point on that access. Right? You can find people on the left who are very in favor of democratizing access, very in favor of disclosure. I think on the right it tends to be more biased. Like, let's democratize access, but let's not replace that with the appropriate disclosure guidelines. And I think that to me has been where a lot of the political tension has been around this issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think on some level, proponents of Web3 and blockchain would say, well, that's the kind of transparency and disclosures that this allows, because anybody can get up, look on Etherscan or a block explorer and see exactly how many tokens have been issued, how many have been minted, what's been traded amongst wallets. But it sounds like we haven't done a good job as an industry of sort of laying out, making that usable information.
Well, I'm going to say something harsh here. That's sort of like saying, I own a bat and therefore I'm a baseball player. Right? That is a necessary but insufficient precondition of a proper transparency and disclosure regime. As you and I were talking about outside, pick any cryptocurrency you want. How much is in circulation today? How much of what's in circulation is subject to wash trades? How much is being issued by somebody who has a deep conflict of interest because they're both run an exchange and are a broker, or some high-profile people that we know about? How much of that is being traded on exchange versus off exchange? If it's a stable coin, what is the nature of the reserves? Are those disclosed on a regular basis? And you can't answer any of those questions for almost any, like, okay, it's on the blockchain, right? But you still have a broader sort of accounting and rigor. And I don't say that as a criticism, right? Because, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I ran some startup companies. I was often in positions where I was competing against companies that were 10 times my size and having to pretend like I also had the sophistication that you expect from them, a robust service department, a 24/7 helpline, robust. I didn't have it, but you got to fake it till you make it, right? And there's nothing wrong with in an emerging industry of saying we've got some cool things, we've got the beginnings of this, but don't pretend to be J.P. Morgan, right? There's a robustness of audit standard and protection that's just not there yet. And we were chatting on the way out. I think there have been more stable coins that have broken the buck than there have been money market funds that have broken the buck. It ain't stable.
Well,
that's it. And I'm not saying that because the technology is bad. I'm saying that because it's been hard to see what is the actual robust accounting that you would have if you were a money market fund and be required to have if you were a money market fund that would also apply if you're a algorithmic stablecoin, or something that got bailed out because you had uninsured reserves that, when we bailed out SVB and Signature, all of a sudden the reserve, but it was a bailout, right?
For sure. Although I think in fairness, there are good faith economists even that would suggest that especially in the case of of USDC, that it was actually Circle's exposure to the traditional finance market and those problems that caused the concern in the run. It wasn't actually, Circle's accounting was quite transparent, but I should say, I should make the distinction that there's the tokenized asset that has backing that's not on chain. So there is that piece that needs the accounting, and I think Circle in particular is very good about posting all that. I think Tether's has been more of a moving target, that there's room to improve. And I think that is a really important piece of it. I think if you look at the strictly like Bitcoin, where it's just this is what's minted, this is what's on chain, you can tell. I mean, that is very transparent, but it does sound.
But even with Bitcoin, you still got the open wash trade question, right? Like how much of the value that's there is true supply demand and not a wash trade? And I don't know how to answer that question, right? But I know.
Yeah, I think the important difference, and I say this as a longtime financial prosecutor, the difference is anybody, including half of Twitter, can get on to a block explorer and see, I see indicators of wash trading based on all this data, Whereas when Enron's happening, there's really nobody other than the FBI that can go in and see that. And so there's a lot of room to improve. And we were talking about some like Solidus Labs and some of these other technology companies that are actually creating the tech that we'd love to have in TradFi, particularly when I was a prosecutor, because you can see on the blockchain all this activity that says this does not look real, this looks artificial. Whereas when I was prosecuting banks for money laundering, there was nothing to see. I mean, there's literally nothing. The best you could do was pull somebody over in a car with $300,000 in his back trunk, and you'd ask him where he was banking.
Yeah, no, and
I think the potential's there. But
well, I would still just say like that's a Web3 argument, not a currency argument, right? Because if French Hill and I have had this, I gather you're going to have him here shortly. He and I have had this conversation back and forth. And this wasn't on the record, but I'm sure French wouldn't mind that. I said, let's imagine that French Hill and I are the two CEOs of the two biggest companies in the world, and we have a bunch of interfacing relationships, and we're, on a minute-by-minute basis, we have a bunch of interactions with each other. We would love to have a Web3 relationship that was tracking all that information back and forth, and we'd settle up at the end of the month, and we'd net it out, and the token, if you will, that we would be exchanging is an invoice. Right? Yeah. Like it's not something that we want to be decoupled from an indexing to a current. Like we want to settle in dollars, right? It's it's a token. That's a separate question. So I think the challenge is not whether or not Web3 and blockchain is a good way to solve what at core is an accounting problem, right? The question is, if you have people trading on that who are betting on essentially a foreign exchange spread on top of this, is that foreign exchange spread tied to some underlying form of value that is understandable, that's tied to something fundamental, or is that underlying tied to something that is illegal or illicit or dodging the law and just too hard to track? And that's not a blockchain question. That's all the other audit and controls question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think we just created a startup for you and French Hill, which I'm excited about. But I think
this is predicated on me and French Hill being the CEOs of the two largest companies in the world. Finally, we will fix Twitter.
They'll give us feedback. There's no doubt. But I think that's a really important distinction that in our last bit of time left, I'd love to tease out a bit, because I think that Web3 versus crypto distinction, for me coming out of Treasury, was like very compelling. And as a lifelong progressive that served in the Obama White House, like this is a chance to have very transparent and accessible and democratized access in a way that's also secure and resilient, from cryptographically speaking. It sounds like there's issues where that connects with the real world and what's the fidelity between that connection. But it sounds like you do feel that there's something positive in the underlying tech. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, the underlying tech is fascinating. I mean, what Kodak said is cool, right? I mean, I have friends who are musicians who complain all the time that they used to make money and now Spotify hoses them. Like, it would be awesome. Like, I'd like I'd like more of that in the world. I mean, I think fixing social media, like, how would we get to a world where we have personal data portability, but there still is an incentive for someone to build the algorithms? Like that's a Web3 kind of conversation. What I think is much less persuasive is that requires a different currency, right? Because like so much of, I mean, this has not been a good month for cryptocurrencies, right? Between Hamas, Binance, all of this information that North Korea is funding their nuclear weapons program, they can't do that with Web3, right? That's because of the currency piece of this, and I come back to my concern for, the smart young person who, when I was a kid was watching late night TV and being persuaded by Glenn Beck to buy gold, and is now reading the same logic and saying, well, there's something at play here. And that's where I get worried about who's going to be taken advantage in a world of informational asymmetry, because somebody always is taken advantage of in a world of informational asymmetry. But that's not about, I take your point, like the blockchain is not about information asymmetry. The currency part of that, absent much more robust accounting controls and audit functions, has a real concern as we sit here right now.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think a lot of this conversation, it feels like there's a lot more alignment, I think, between what you're saying and actually the Web3 community in many ways. in the sense that Satoshi Nakamoto's paper was all about creating that transparency so that people weren't being fleeced by banks. And I think even the current CFPB enforcement has been very much, okay, here's a bank that I think it was Citibank just was fined $20 million for debanking everybody of Armenian descent in their last name, or Wells Fargo or B of A was opening accounts in people's names without telling them, things like that. And the idea of Bitcoin being on a public ledger was to sort of avoid that because it's so transparent. But that piece where we link back over into the real world and off the ledger is where you have that disconnect. And I think that's I mean, on some level, I think there are folks that would say crypto's had actually a great month. We washed out the fraud, off-chain fraud of Sam Bankman-Fried. The Hamas piece was detected right away because of the on-chain transparency. And to the extent that there was some laundering, it was the off-chain activity that we see in banks, and 90% of that, of their wealth was actually off-chain. It was TradFi, it wasn't. So I think getting that, I mean, what I hear is, which is really helpful, I think, is like, there is belief in Congress in sort of the Web3 and the infrastructure, but you have to fix the connection to the off-chain world.
Yeah, and I guess, and I'd maybe just leave an entrepreneurial question for you here. You know, goodness knows there's plenty of concerns about banking scandals lately. I mean,
yeah.
there was a point on the Financial Services Committee where every time we brought in that big bank CEOs, I was like, who is the Wells Fargo CEO going to be this time? So like, I take your point, but whether it's banks or a Web3 company, like there is still an intermediation function, right? There is somebody who has to connect, you know, people who have capital to people who need capital. And somebody's going to get paid for that intermediation function. And I think what I think intrigues me as an entrepreneur, going back to my Kodak conversations, is the higher the intermediation fee, whether this is like a legitimate fee, whether it's a junk fee, whether this is, you know, all sorts of shenanigans like you just talked about, there's a monopoly rent in the middle of that, right? The higher that fee, the less efficient the markets are. And to the extent we're making those markets more efficient, that's terrific. I will tell you that in my 5 years of Congress, the next business that comes into my office and says the problem with my industry is that it is insufficiently competitive will be the first. Yeah. Like nobody comes in and pushes for market efficiency because there's no money in an efficient market. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's an interesting, I think the theory of Kodak's case, you know, and again, I say this as somebody who was trying to determine whether this was something that would allow me to go to my lenders, to my board, and say, yes, Kodak is now a better credit risk than they were before. Was sitting there and saying, this is really cool. Photographers are going to get money every time somebody buys their photographer. How much money does Kodak make off this? I have no idea. Like, what is the business case for being a very efficient intermediator, right? Yeah. And I'm not. That's not raised as a criticism. I think there is a tension in any mature market that you need the intermediation function, and the intermediation function has to take a cut. Yeah, and I think, and what does that cut looks like? But it's not going to be a perfectly efficient market.
For sure, and I think actually to me the beauty and the ethos of Web3 is actually it is an ethos more than a business case, which is we can, through solving double spending so that there's no such thing as a account overdraft. You know, by solving that, we can actually reduce the role of banks so that you don't have to have someone checking accounts. It's just impossible as a cryptographic ledger. You can't have a double spending or an overdraft fee. So by reducing those fees, you're actually empowering people to pay less. Mm-hmm. So I think in that sense, it's a great alignment. But you're right. It's not a business case, but on some level, at least for many people, that is the beauty of the ethos of this, is like we're empowering people for themselves. So
and the Casten French Hill, like, we don't need accountants checking all the numbers, right?
Yeah,
like at the end of the month, it automatically ties. Like, it would be kind of cool. Right?
Yeah, awesome. Well, we're way over time because this has been awesome. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming out.
Thanks so much.